Welcome everyone to Tapes on Trial, where we dissect media and tell you if it deserves a reaping or not. I'm your favorite undead judge, the Reaper of the Tapes. Now, let's head into the fog. The fog is an interesting subject. When people talk about John Carpenter, they mention the likes of Halloween, The Thing, They Live, Escape from New York, or even his adaptation of Christine. The fog is like the redheaded stepchild of the Carpenter films. It only gets brought up by those who deeply love horror cinema. So that begs the question, does this movie deserve praise or said reaping? That's what we're here to find out. The movie opens up with a quote by Edgar Allan Poe. I guess Carpenter wanted to make us think deep about this or something, but honestly, not many people really think about the quotes that much. It's a horror movie after all. Actually, from what I understand, it was Deborah Hill's idea, and not Carpenter, who pushed for this quote to be in the movie. It seems Deborah Hill liked subtlety more, as subtlety somewhat went away from Carpenter films as he got older. We're introduced to a group of children and their storyteller, who tells us the story of a clipper ship whose crew was killed by sinkage. Legend has it on the anniversary of their deaths they would return. Well, it just so happens that it actually is the anniversary. We get treated to some nice cinematography, as well as the movie title, which then transitions to a church. Here we meet Father Malone, portrayed by Hal Holbrook, and Bennett, portrayed by an unaccredited John Carpenter, who asks Father Malone about his pay, which he responds to by telling him to come in later in the day. I like this little cameo, but what upsets me is we never get a follow-up on his character. Father Malone then gets spooked by a rock that falls out of the wall, introducing us to the Diary of Exposition. This is where things begin to get weird, as electronics go haywire, phones ring, glass bottles shake, and even dogs begin to bark at the unknowing. Here we are introduced to our main characters, the voice of Stevie Wayne, portrayed by Adrienne Barbeau, Nick Castle, portrayed by Tom Atkins, and Elizabeth Soley, portrayed by Jamie Lee Curtis. Yes, I will bring up the fact that the Nick Castle character is named after Nick Castle, friend of John Carpenter, who's also known as being the Shape himself, Michael Myers. Nick picks up Elizabeth, already exchanging some fun and humorous dialogue, and might I add the 80s were certainly a different time. You could drink and get away with it if the beer was in a can. So remember kids, it's okay to drink and drive if it's in a can.
Then we start drinking Miller Lite in cans, because Hulk drinks Miller Lite in cans. And we're thinking, bro, cans? What's with the cans, bro? And he goes, bro, they don't serve soda in bottles anymore. You can hide a can with your hand.
We get quickly introduced to Dan the Weatherman, also credited as Dan O'Bannon, portrayed by Charles Cyphers, who's trying to hit on Stevie by mentioning the fog bank coming in. I want to draw attention to the name Dan being named Dan O'Bannon, as a possible nod to the writer of the same name, mostly known for screenwriting Alien, as well as later on Return of the Living Dead. To me, that's just a neat little nod. The three men on the boat, known as the Seagrass, refuse to believe the weather report, only to shortly regret their words. They go to check out the fog bank, only to be introduced to what looks like a pirate ship, which is known as the Elizabeth Dane, which only appears for a short period of time. They make out a group of figures in the distance, only to be killed off quickly one by one. The kills are simple, but they work for this movie, the third person even getting his eyes gouged out. We eventually cut back to Nick and Elizabeth after an implied sex scene, which gives the background on Elizabeth's character. She's traveling to Vancouver in hopes of making it big as an artist, and yeah, that's basically it. They hear a knock at the door as it turns out to be another one of the mysterious pirate people on the other side of the door. Nick goes to answer, but is saved by the clock as the witching hour is over. The next day, one of the kids from the opening scene finds a coin that transforms into a piece of the Elizabeth Dane on the beach. Turns out the child is Stevie's son Andy. Now, with this subtle connection of these two characters, we learn that Stevie's a possible widow, having lost her husband somehow, because that seems to me personally like more of a logical reason, as it gives sympathy to these characters. Stevie thinks nothing of the driftwood, encouraging her son to go look back on the beach later while she gets ready to work. Nick and Elizabeth go out looking for the seagrass, in which they easily seem to do, while one of the fishermen's wives, who's portrayed by Janet Leigh, is setting up for the festival to celebrate the founding fathers of Antonio Bay. She decides to visit Father Malone with her assistant, where they get the much-needed exposition, being that the ghost pirate people were a diseased colony that were looking to migrate to the land, but were led into rocks in the middle of the night, sinking in the process. Their gold was taken and used to fund what would become known as Antonio Bay. That sounds like a good reason to come back and haunt an island of people. While all this is going on, Nick and Elizabeth find the corpse of one of the fishermen, giving us one of those classic Jamie Lee Curtis screams that she's known for. Back to Stevie as she heads to work with the piece of wood, which somehow expels a bunch of water, then catches fire with the new words that said, "6 must die." This is a pretty effective scene, honestly. It slowly builds up and I have no complaints about it. It even uses the radio in a creepy way, which is impressive. Stevie phones her son to ask about the piece of wood, and she tells him to stay home. And it's moments like this that make the viewer a bit confused, because most viewers aren't sure if Nick is the main character, or if it's actually Stevie due to the development we're getting. We cut back to Nick and Elizabeth at the coroner's office, where the coroner tries to convince Nick that the body that was found had been underwater, but Nick responds by telling him it's impossible because it was found on the boat. While all this is going on, the pirate ghosts apparently possess the body, attempt an attack on Elizabeth, fails, and leaves a carving of the number 3 on the ground. This scene confuses the group, but it's never brought up again. Also, there's a continuity issue during this scene where Elizabeth's hair is shorter, and is the only scene where she's wearing sneakers as opposed to the boots she wears. Let's just blame it on the reshoots and continue on. While transitioning to the bar, Nick overhears Stevie on the radio, which prompts him to call to the radio station. This is the first time the two characters interact, which is pretty late because by this point we're halfway through the film. Stevie brings up the piece of driftwood, which prompts Nick and Elizabeth to go pick it up. Our favorite weatherman then calls Stevie to warn her about the incoming fog bank, which means another attack is coming soon. Dan goes to check on the fog only to get a knock at the door and thinks he's being pranked. He opens it, only to be greeted by a hook to the neck, ending his career as a weatherman, as well as his life. Stevie is left speechless by what she just heard, so she requests to speak to the sheriff, only for both the phone lines and the power to be cut by the fog. She rushes to the generator in hopes to get back on the air and warn everyone as the fog begins to move in on the unsuspecting town, with her own home becoming the next target. The babysitter tells Andy to lock all the doors and windows as Stevie yells over the radio for someone to get Andy out of the house. But with the power out, it's only likely that people can only hear through car radios, so Nick and Elizabeth head to the house in a hurry. Normally, I don't think this would be wise to advertise your home in case a stranger's trying to abduct your child, but I guess having your son kidnapped is somehow safer than being killed by an unexplainable fog bank. Andy's told to hide in his room as the babysitter answers the door and is dragged to her untimely doom, getting hooked by 2 other ghost pirates. They make their way to Andy's room and Nick rushes to save him. Pardon the pun, just in the nick of time. As they try to escape, they realize the truck is stuck, creating a moment of suspense as the fog pirates get closer. But they're saved by plot armor, I guess. Now this is the thing I don't understand. These 2 characters are supposed to be your main characters, but yet they don't really have ties to the main story or the villains other than being at the wrong place at the wrong time, as well as getting too invested in the mystery. This seems to be a constant with Carpenter films, one being Halloween with Laurie Strode prior to Halloween 2's family connection. It's not really explained if they're being targeted due to Nick's lineage, though there is a short moment in the film that speaks about Nick's father. Long ago, he too had an experience with a ship with a similar name to the Elizabeth Dane, but he lived. And we know it isn't Elizabeth's lineage because she's just a traveler, but she considers herself bad luck, and I don't think that it's nearly enough to be considered a target. So why are the pirates targeting random people now? Well, either it isn't explained properly, or we're inclined to believe that the fog and its pirates are similar to Michael Myers and just targeting people at random because it is considered scarier and more unpredictable. Stevie continues to give directions as to where the fog is headed, which leads everyone to the old church. When the characters get to the church, they try to hide, while Father Malone has basically given up by this point. Questions about the journal arise in hopes that the journal will have a solution, so Nick rushes to get the journal, which upon reading they realize that there's one more conspirator to be claimed. Further reading uncovers that in good faith someone must return Blake's gold to him. By this time, the radio station has been engulfed by the fog, which means Stevie is a target. Though it's never explained why, all she can do is hold off the pirates until the gold is returned, going as far as to climbing to the rooftop to protect herself. We find out the gold had been melted into a cross and hid in the church just in case this kind of thing ever does happen. I guess it's nice to always have some sort of backup plan in case vengeful spirits come knocking on your door. Father Malone heads back to the main area where we finally get a glimpse of Blake, and I'm fairly certain that's Admiral Crackers. I mean, I guess it makes sense. After he OD'd on heroin, he wanted vengeance. Blake pulls his sword out, but instead of striking down Father Malone, he grabs the golden cross and the cross begins to oddly glow, sending the pirates away and seemingly ends the horrible night. The characters head outside to see the fog roll away, as we get a haunting monologue by Stevie, which then transitions to Father Malone returning to where the scene of the action was. Father Malone hears something, and as he looks around, Blake returns to claim the last conspirator, ending the movie on a high note. Now, this is the part we've all been waiting for. Does this film deserve a reaping and be sent to the afterlife? Or is this movie going to get a pass? Well, this movie had mediocre character development. For what was given with the runtime, the time is evenly split amongst most of the characters, which is a plus, but in a movie like this, you don't really get backstory for them. But you don't want to see them die because most of them are likable in certain aspects. The Elizabeth character is an interesting one. The fact that there's an implied sexual encounter early on between her and Nick, but yet doesn't die, I guess that trope just wasn't as big a deal at the time, despite Jamie Lee Curtis being typecasted during that period as the good girl next door / final girl. Actually, there are a lot of characters doing somewhat bad things that they surprisingly get away with, like Nick being a drunk driver. I really wish at the end you get to see Stevie reunite with her son, since it would have helped the character development of both characters. Honestly though, I kinda liked they went against the stereotypes for a horror film on this one. One of my favorite things is that you don't hate all the characters like in other films. Looking at you, Rob Zombie's Halloween films. This is one of those films where mystery takes over, where keeping the characters in the dark is for the better. Look at the Blake character. You never really see his entire design really, just the ghostly image of him with the red eyes. The only way you truly see his full image was by buying the Blake action figure. But regardless of those facts, he doesn't utter a phrase throughout the entire movie. We let Father Malone tell his story, and this movie does a good job with conveying Blake's story. This movie had a great cast. Jamie Lee Curtis pulls off another classic Carpenter character. Apparently she couldn't find much work after Halloween, which was a shame, but after this, things changed for her. Tom Adkins is the man as always. This was before his appearance in Halloween 3, which he performed great in as well, and he did great here. And honestly, I really think Tom Adkins just likes using phones in his movies. And when it comes to comparing our two leads, they both had great chemistry in the scenes they shared together. Janet Leigh had some great moments as well. She's a well-seasoned actress at this point. It's just she wasn't given much to do, which is understandable. I have no complaints really. Adrienne Barbeau though, let's talk about her. Her character's role in the film I feel is so important, which is understandable considering her and John Carpenter had a thing during this point. Honestly, I don't think anyone could have done this role justice because this role was basically written for her. Her performance just gives this film power in itself. As for Father Malone, Hal Holbrook does a great job with his material and I feel shows great range. He's a reliable narrator and a relatable character that you honestly feel bad for in the end because he never asked for the fate that he was handed. Let's finally talk about the big baddie himself, Blake. Blake is rarely seen as most of the pirates are hidden in the fog to add suspense, but when you see Blake, he gives this immense feeling of uneasiness, which is what every good villain needs. I honestly can't give the character enough praise because of how he was built up, but I can also see why he wasn't as memorable as Michael or Jason. Overall, John Carpenter must have felt like a familiar cast and crew would really help, because during pre-production he was being pressured to write Halloween 2, but had already signed on to make The Fog, and the deal was that if he could continue production on The Fog, then he would do some kind of work on Halloween 2. So having familiar faces on this set must have eased his worries of a sequel to Halloween. This movie had a unique plot. While everyone brings up the name of this movie, a lot of them think of Stephen King's The Mist, which I understand why. But if you explain the story, people will want to check this out. I mentioned that the movie does a great job at conveying Blake's story, and it does. It's a good tale of revenge that hasn't been replicated, even in the remake. There's just something scary about living on cursed land with evil fog pirates that gets me every time. It's not Hollywood milking something, it's running with a ball creatively that just hooks you. This fits in with all the other classic ghost stories that you may have heard one way or another, and I think that's rather fitting. Another thing I will note is that John Carpenter is good at making small callbacks to his previous films without making it too obvious. Like having one of the characters being named Dick Baxter, the use of a station wagon, and of course his reoccurring cast members. Honestly, the only thing that takes me out of the movie are some dumb decisions made by certain characters, and the amount of continuity errors, but if you don't overly think about things like this, then you can switch your brain off and enjoy it with no problems. One thing about John Carpenter is he always manages to reinvent the wheel when it needs to be done, no matter what mistakes get made. For the music, I think John Carpenter hits it on the head perfectly. The score is unique, considering it's a John Carpenter score. You know you're in for a treat. The main theme to this movie is up there with the Halloween theme, as well as others like the Exorcist theme. And while some may disagree with that comment, I will say this is certainly one of the songs I listen to in some of my own playlists, so it's subjective. The music creates that feeling of uneasiness that reminds you that you're watching a Carpenter film. The cinematography and directing is great. John Carpenter and Dean Cundey do a great job with both their roles, making the movie feel like you're there in some cases. Carpenter specifically because his camera work has patience and grace to it. People usually bring up the fact that this movie is very visual, and I'll say that is true because when describing things, it's hard not to spoil. It's got this breathtaking essence to it that you don't always see, especially for the time in which this was filmed. It has this see-to-believe aspect to it that makes it an astonishing piece of film history. For the effects, I think those go hand in hand with the directing and cinematography. The effect of the fog is ahead of its time. Not going with black and white to cheapen the cost and creep value is a good call. I understand that movies would look kinda silly in black and white during the 80s anyways, but it was a cost-cutting option that surely did exist. The use of limited fog machines, dry ice, as well as real fog gives the movie a real feel, which of course was what they were going for, and I'm glad it worked out. The effects were done by Rob Bottin, and while very green at the time, he did go on to do some other great films, but this was one of the very early films that gave him a chance to get his creative juices flowing, paying off in the end. He even went as far as to take on the role of Blake while doing these effects. Now that's dedication. While you don't really see what the pirate ghosts look like, you do get to see the red eyes, as well as one of the faces of them, but that's to keep subtlety. My main complaint is how we only see the pirate ship for the one scene. I feel it could have been used more. Extending the film for a few more scenes to show off the impressive ship could have added to it. But alas, we didn't get it. But it doesn't take away from anything. It was a well-known fact that Carpenter had to reshoot some of the scenes for this movie, adding in gore to fit with the time, but it makes me wish to have seen a screener or a work print of that time to see what he was going for before reshooting scenes. For all we know, it truly could have been a different movie in terms of flow. And the verdict is? No, this film gets a pass. I think this movie holds a special place in horror cinema history. Despite being considered a box office failure, it did make its money back, which puzzles me. A lot of people hated it at the time, but it does have a cult following, and while part of me wants a sequel, I'm glad it's just a standalone film. I know there's been talk of a sequel, but who knows what could have been done. It would be weird to make a franchise out of this concept. I know there's a remake we don't speak about, but to make a sequel is just another level of weird thinking. When most people talk about John Carpenter, they speak about what are considered his two most important films, Halloween and The Thing. But honestly, The Fog is so overlooked. The Fog is honestly much like what The Birds was for Alfred Hitchcock. It was the next big follow-up to a film that was considered a masterpiece in so many aspects, so obviously it was going to pale in comparison because it didn't have those same level of characters or similar situations, but instead was replaced with atmosphere and mystery. Maybe this film won't be for everyone, but I recommend it to those who want to dive deeper into horror or more John Carpenter films. Anyways, thank you all for watching, and until next time, I've been your favorite undead judge, the Reaper of the Tapes, and you've been watching Tapes on Trial. We'll see you next time. Hey you, if you liked this video, make sure to like, comment, favorite, subscribe, and share this video around. If that's not enough, why not go watch another from the channel in the meantime? Don't be too afraid.